he is. I see him. Good afternoon. I want to add my welcome to this year's Powering the People, Innovations for a Better World. I want to compliment Lisa and her team at IE for putting together this outstanding event. We're going to move immediately, though, to our headliner, and I'll come back up when he's finished his remarks. Scheduling is always a trick when Congress is actually in session, as they are at the moment. Senator Wyden was elected to the United States Senate in 1996 after serving in the House of Representatives for 15 years. We're now very fortunate as a nation to have him as chair of the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. And from my own personal experience, he's willing to see things for himself and learn, not just by reading and listening to people coming by his office in Washington. Last summer, he took the time to visit one of Dominion's coal-fired stations in West Virginia in our co-located wind farm. The senator visited those sites and many others across West Virginia and other parts of the nation to learn more on hand and see himself what is actually going on out there in production of energy. He is known for his bipartisan approach to solving problems, his effectiveness in getting things done, and his creative approach to very complex problems, particularly in healthcare, technology, and natural resources. We thank him for his service to the United States and for joining us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Senator Ron Wyden.
Tom, thank you very much, and you're absolutely right. The Senate's in session now, and it just, as soon as you said that, it made me reflect on something. Somebody came up to me at a town hall meeting not too long ago and said, Ron, I like you. You are a really good guy. You're independent. You have all these different ideas. But to tell you the truth, I mostly feel safe when you people are not in session. So I thank you for your kind remarks. And Tom and the group asked me to talk for about an hour or so. And there's some people back there who think I'm serious. Their face got all pale, trying to figure out how in the world they would get out in time. And no, I'm really here to just make sure you know that there's lots of support for what you're doing. I think I speak for virtually everybody on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee that we're watching the work that is going on here, Innovation Alley. These are efforts, much like electricity itself, that are really the lifeblood of modern American society, our ability to generate fresh, creative kinds of strategies. And obviously, when we think about the future, I've been particularly interested in the digital, economy. I mean, a big part of the digital economy runs on electricity. And as the demands on the grid grow, so will our need to innovate, to be more creative, and in effect to kind of turn this old model, the old analog grid, in effect on its head and create the new digital grid, which of course we all know as this creature called the smart grid. And all of you are making a lot of headway in terms of implementing it. EEI projects that by 2015, half of the meters in our country will be smart meters. And suffice it to say, we're starting to see some benefits from all of this already in terms of improved reliability, outage detection, a variety of benefits, a kind of a ripple effect is being picked up already. The $4.5 billion in funds for the smart grid in the Recovery Act, in my view, helped to spur a lot of this activity to this point. But I think it's pretty obvious that now we've got to find fresh kinds of approaches, certainly with this kind of deficit, $16 trillion plus debt. We're going to have to find fresh ways to transform and modernize our electricity system. And I thought what I would do is, rather than sort of talk you comatose by just rattling off all of these smart grid technologies and systems, what I'd do is spend just a few minutes talking about what some of the principles are and what some of the enablers are with respect to smart grid deployment, and sort of the converse as well, some of the barriers to smart grid deployment also. Now, to me, and this is a big job for policymakers and the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and I think to a great extent policymakers generally, and that is to, in effect, broaden out how energy policy is made. For years and years, certainly since I have been in the Congress, and I came with a full head of hair and rugged good looks and all of that. My older daughter told me recently, she said, "Dad, I've been studying the Senate. I'm really getting into this and watching it. And some of those folks in the Senate are sort of, Dad, getting up there." And she said, "I've been figuring it out, Dad. You are in the only profession on earth where somebody your age is actually one of the young guys." And the reference point, certainly for my time in the Congress, and I was on the Energy Committee in the House, has always been about energy production. That's been the focus. It's kind of like everybody had a set of blinders on and talked about production, and the major kind of focus was this region produces this and this region produces that, and everybody kind of sit back and forth and talk about that. I want it understood that I think that is still a critical part of the debate. But what has been missing, and what I'm going to try to put on the radar at every step of the way, is a new guidepost that in effect stresses that the consumer is the key here. The residential consumer, the business consumer, they can no longer be an afterthought in the debates of the future. And to me, as we talk about consumers, that's really the first and most important part of the enabling kind of approach with respect to the smart grid. And I think you figured this out a long time before the Congress did, since you're calling your program Powering the People. And there's obviously a lot of discussion about the benefits to consumers of the information and energy controls that are key to the grid. But if we don't do more to spark interest among consumers, those kinds of features aren't going to be installed. They aren't going to get used. And certainly what consumers don't know about and they don't understand is not going to get us very far in the evolution of the grid and where we would like to go. And I think we all understand. There was interesting comment made, Senator Murkowski and I, you've had some of the other legislators, and people were talking about the surveys they took, and they would ask consumers what it was they were most interested in. And people would invariably come back and say low rates. And then they would come back and say, what's the second thing you're most interested in? They would say low rates. And what's the third thing you're most interested in? Low rates. And so, I mean, you get a sense that the smart grid is something that can allow us to meet that focus that consumers are going to have in a tough, economy, but to tap the efficiencies and the operating savings that they create, we're going to have to do more to get the word out. For example, reading meters remotely unquestionably can yield significant savings. But when you really strip it down, unless all parties concerned, state regulators and utilities and the federal government, do a better job explaining the benefits to the consumer, I think we're going to be here a few years from now and asking ourselves, why didn't we tap those kinds of opportunities when we had them? Second guidepost, which is also a driver for the smart grid, is what I call the transition and the effort to promote a low-carbon economy. And for starters, it makes the electricity system more efficient and reduces emissions. I also think that this is a political principle that can bring both sides together. I can go to plenty of meetings on Capitol Hill, and if the climate change concept is brought up, that can send everybody into their separate corners, slugging away in a hurry. If you go to that same meeting and say, let's look at the prospects for promoting a low-carbon economy, then you can have a very different kind of discussion, because senators and legislators of a variety of different views can look to approaches in their area that promote a low-carbon economy. For example, the smart grid is critical to successfully integrating power sources like rooftop solar panels, small-scale biomass, which is very important in our part of the world. I'm sure you've all filled out your brackets for March Madness and have the Ducks in the Final Four. But biomass is the kind of thing in Oregon that really does give you a chance to talk about the smart grid and renewable energy in a very specific way. And obviously there are other distributed renewable resources that are part of the electric distribution system as well. And we're just not going to know how much more renewables can be connected to an electric distribution system without more specific information about existing generation and load onto the system. Smart grid can get us that information. A smart grid can get us that kind of data. And finally, another area where I'm particularly excited about the promise of the smart grid is its role in energy storage. And I will tell you on this one, my staff was way, way ahead of me on it. We have a wonderful staffer, some of you may know Dave Barrick, who years ago came to me and said, you've really got to understand how important energy storage is and the connection it has to intermittent power, which of course is solar and wind. And he rattled off a couple of algorithms, and I was pretty much asleep. And I said, Dave, you go to it. You go to it, guy. I trust you. You do a great job. And about a month or so later, he said, well, we're going to speak at some conference. We're going to use a video in the morning to talk about energy storage. And it's in a small town in North Carolina, and you'll need to be there at 8. And I said, boy, this is going to really be a snooze. There are going to be 15 folks even sleepier than me in North Carolina at 8 a.m. And we'll talk a little about energy storage. And we had developed, I'm on the finance committee, some incentive approaches, tax credits and the like. And I walked in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and there were more than 400 people from all over the country, VCs and universities and scientists and entrepreneurs, who figured out long before me, not before Dave Barrick, what the potential is. And energy storage is also, in my view, going to be a major facet of a smart grid, transforming variables like wind and solar into firm power. And this, too, can help reduce the costs for consumers. And we had your council and the council of other groups. And last summer, I have introduced legislation to provide incentives for energy storage. And I think whatever happens in tax reform, I think we're going to find a way to promote energy storage as part of the tax debate. The next area that I'd offer up as a guidepost is the business model kind of area. We've got to come up with new business models that make it easier for consumers to embrace smart grid technologies and for utility companies to pull them into their system, to integrate it into their system. And to me, one of the good examples in this area is the residential and commercial solar industry. They found that relatively few customers could afford the upfront costs of the rooftop system. So rather than just sit around and bemoan, that fact that the customer couldn't, pay for it up front, a number of the solar installers started to offer long-term power purchase or lease arrangements with little or no upfront costs, not unlike buying or leasing a car. And of course, if you're trying to bring something new into the American economy and into the energy system, what would be better than citing something that consumers know something about, because they've leased, cars and bought a car, and it's something that people are more comfortable with. So this has been a business model that's actually paying off and being used in states around the country. And I think we ought to look for small, smart grid business models that can also open up markets and could be used by utility companies, and utilities would be seen by consumers as partners in the effort to come up with new business models for the smart grid rather than some kind of adversarial relationship that sends people to the ramparts. And finally, let me just mention the federal role in all this. When you spend $4.5 billion of taxpayer money to demonstrate new technologies, and that's what the federal government has done with the smart grid, you better be able to tell taxpayers what you're getting. You know, what kind of information and lessons learned from all this can be shared. And one complaint that I have heard from people in the electric utility industry is that the Department of Energy in particular hasn't done enough to share the results of the smart grid demonstration projects that have been undertaken. And we are going to do more in the days ahead to change that and to make sure that the value of this investment is realized and communicated. So that's number one in terms of the federal role. Number two, it seems to me the federal government ought to move more quickly to align the growth of smart grid devices and access to the telecommunications spectrum that would allow utility companies to, in effect, be able to communicate with those devices. And this is especially important for smart grid devices that are installed at the retail level in homes and businesses, smart meters, solar panels, things of that nature. And fundamentally, what it comes down to is without being able to gather the information from smart grid devices and send them the control signals that make them so valuable, I guess the smart grid becomes sort of a busy signal. I mean, that's what you'd really get is people just walk away, the horrible noise of a business signal. And first impressions, particularly now as people kind of think through what all this means, the last thing you want to do is have them think they're getting a perpetual busy signal. So to me, what we're going to be looking at on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee is to get some of the key agencies, FERC would be another, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to become advocates for ensuring that there's sufficient spectrum to accommodate the smart grid, and the Federal Communications Commission needs to be a willing listener in terms of meeting those needs. Finally, let's talk about the role of the states. It is sort of hard to find a media profile of a state utility commission chair or the elected member of a municipal utility board that really has had a long-standing, interest, in this. Rate bases, rates of return, and this is my favorite, the prudency review, may not be an interest to most, readers unless they're trying to find a way to get to sleep. And the question is, who's got decision-making authority over the deployment of the smart grid, and particularly the role of the state regulator? And we're going to have to do more to convince state regulators that the smart grid is good for consumers and otherwise worth doing. And that means sort of keeping an eye on the state level to make sure that if you start things in the right direction in Washington, D.C., you continue it at the state level. To me, what it really comes down to is the modernization of our country's electric system is underway, and the question is now, are we going to allow that momentum to accelerate, or are we going to just sort of play nice and think that it's all going to happen by osmosis? The Recovery Act clearly, as I indicated, helped, and it certainly promoted some innovation. What we've got to do now is leverage that progress, leverage the resources, leverage the expertise that was developed, and create new public-private partnerships. For example, the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado is now opening a new state-of-the-art user test facility called the Energy Systems Integration Facility. This would be the first facility in the country that can conduct integrated megawatt-scale research and development into advanced distributed energy systems. Industry would be able to work with those kinds of national lab experts to develop and evaluate their individual technologies, and they could do it on a controlled, integrated energy system, platform. Now, there are plenty of other public-private partnerships, and I think by way of wrapping it up is the reason that your program is so important, and Innovation Alley and saw the vehicles as I was coming, is I think your work and the progress that's been made puts us on the right side of history. I think that's what the kind of judgment about the last few years and the progress that's been made has me concluding. The question is now, can we mobilize and make sure that the private sector and utilities and technology vendors and the financial community and all of those who helped us get where we are today can reach for the next level. And I just want you to know that I'm going to do everything I can to move this often clumsy, often unwieldy machinery of the federal government around, all the alphabet agencies, DOE and FERC and the FCC and the like. I'm going to do everything I can to move this machinery of the federal government around to make the federal government as nimble and valuable a partner to all of you who are doing good work in the area of promoting the smart grid. That's what I think the future is about, and I'll do everything I can to help the federal government assist you in your work. Thanks for having me.